Hi, and welcome to Check 6, Aviation Week's podcast. I'm Laura Seligman, Aviation Week's Pentagon editor. Joining me is recently retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Dave Burke, a former Top Gun instructor who flew the F-35, F-22, F-16, and F-18 operationally, and Pierre Sprey, a member of the fighter mafia who helped design the A-10 and F-16. So, let's dive right in. We saw the F-35 fly at Paris in a way that we've never seen before. The afterburner takeoff, the high G turns, high AOA pass, pedal turn. Lockheed and Air Force pilots claim that the maneuvers we saw laid to rest the rumors that the F-35 can't dogfight. So, Pierre, do you think that that's true?
Demos are nonsense. They're just marketing hype. Everybody, takes their airplane, strips it down, strips out everything, even the map case, to make it as light as possible, runs it with about, 3 ounces of gas, and makes it look very lively. Actually, there was a very good review of that demo, which was as phony as all other demos are there, by probably the best reporter in Europe, Giovanni De Briganti, Defense Aerospace, and I highly commend it to everybody to read it. And he just poo-pooed the demo, and rightly so, as you should poo-poo any demo, not particularly that one. It doesn't prove squat. They had a super light F-35, and it turned out that the performance wasn't all that impressive. People who've been there a long time have seen a lot more impressive performance. The Russians put on more impressive performances. I happen to think the Russian fighters are not very good, but boy, they're great for air shows. I even talked to a guy who prepped an A-10 for the air show, and they did the same thing. They stripped it out so light it actually looked super maneuverable, right? Which it's not, except at low speed, right? But the truth of the matter is, if you sit with a stopwatch and watch, the actual turn rates, the F-35's turn rate was not impressive. It was like a bunch slower than, say, a 30-year-old F-16. By a friend of mine, engineer, clocked it at 17 degrees per second. And any old F-16, old ones can do 22. So, no, it doesn't prove it doesn't prove it's good, it doesn't prove it's bad. It's just marketing. Forget marketing. It's like using the term fifth generation. That's not a military term. That's a marketing term. Let's talk about combat.
So, yeah, Dave, do you want to talk about your perspective? Because I think yours is pretty different.
Yeah, well, certainly, and I wouldn't disagree. Air show demos are exactly that. They're a demonstration. I think if you want to get into the question of the aircraft's capability in the visual arena, I wouldn't look at an air show and say, see, the air show proves, just like you said, that it can't or can. And I wouldn't say that about any aircraft. I wouldn't watch a Russian demo and go, wow, I can't dogfight with that airplane because he did something, in a visual demonstration. So really no disagreement in that regard. The idea that I think part of the reason why I got so much publicity, or why people seem to be so interested in what the demo did, is that there's been long-standing, long-held misunderstanding of what the airplane can do in the visual arena. And people have made claims that it's incapable of dogfighting and things like that. And even the term dogfighting, I think, is commonly misunderstood. I think the idea that warfare is about two individual airplanes being the only two planes in the sky, kind of maneuvering in relationship to one another, and the one that gets behind the other one now is the victor, and therefore a superior airplane is pretty arcane. My opinion about the demo, I can't speak anything to them taking out map cases. I don't think there's a map case anyway, but I would only offer that when you see airplanes like the F-22 and the F-35 fly, it's unlike other aircraft who have to take off pylons. I think that's really what Mr. Sprey was alluding to, is you're trying to configure these airplanes to do the things to make it look really impressive. From the inside out, I know the airplane well from the inside and know what it's capable of doing, and my frame of reference is always comparing it to the other airplanes. So when he talks about the 30-year-old F-16, I flew it. I flew this amazing airplane at Top Gun, the Block 10s and Block 15s. The F-16 is such an awesome airplane. And that gives me a really good frame of reference when you ask, hey, what do I think of the F-35 or the F-22 or the Hornet? That's kind of the lens I look at it through. I didn't watch the demo and go, see, everybody was wrong, and now everybody's going to be happy. I look at it and go, it's a highly capable, highly maneuverable airplane, like everybody who's ever flown it understands. Now you're starting to get to see some of that. But, it's like you said, it's a demo, certainly. But, for people to say that the airplane can't do things, sometimes seeing is believing, and just maybe give them slightly change the perspective. But I have never been to an air show and taken notes and say what airplanes are better dogfighters based on the demo that they've done.
So one thing that Billy Flynn, who was the Lockheed test pilot who flew the demo, said was that the thing that's different about this airplane and this demo is that you're flying it in a fully ready to go to war with everything it needs to go to war. Right. So that's what a lot of people say. Now, it did not have any weapons inside, and it had 50% fuel. So, Dave, is that, knowing what you know about the F-35, could the F-35 go to war in that configuration?
Without weapons? You're
Yeah.
kidding. You
Well-
must be kidding.
Well, I think what he's getting at is like there's no way. Yeah, so let's just put a little bit of this in context. And context is really important. I think that's the beauty of Mr. Spray and I being here, is you're going to get different perspectives. When you take we kind of getting on the demo idea. So I've taken Raptors to air shows and had the demo pilots fly the Raptors. And I've taken F-18s and seen and watched what they do at F-18. When you take an F-18 or F-16 to a demo, they do exactly what he said. They literally take every single pylon. There's no drag on the airplane. To say there's no weapons in the F-35, it somehow negates it. You put the weapons on the inside of the airplane. So if the weapons, 1,000, 1,500 pounds worth of ordnance for a few missiles, that's about 25, 30 seconds of flying an afterburner. The whole point to the F-22 and the F-35 is that to configure the aircraft for combat doesn't change the flying qualities of the airplane. It doesn't change the external configuration of the airplane. So it's completely accurate to say that he was flying in a combat configuration. And the point of that is if you put ordnance, like physical, weighted ordnance inside of the airplane, nothing would change in terms of the capability of maneuvering of the airplane, especially when we're talking about airplane's got 20,000 pounds of gas in it. Are you starting that dogfight at 15,000 pounds, at 10,000 pounds, at 8,000 pounds, at 6,000 pounds? You get some marginal difference there, but you don't have to do anything to the airplane to make it combat capable. And so when I used to fight in an F-16 and we'd do turning fights in an air-to-air engagement up in a turning fight, if I had pylons and ordnance on the airplane, and the Hornet especially, you have 5 pylons, a FLIR, a laser designator, oh, good grief, you do everything you can to avoid a turning engagement. When I was flying in the Raptor, or flying in the F-35, getting to an engagement, I wouldn't consider, what's my physical configuration? Am I capable of doing a turning engagement now, or do I want to turn with somebody? The decision to turn or not to turn with somebody in the F-22 and F-35 has nothing to do with its configuration. It has to do with whether it's a smart fighter decision. In a Hornet, if I was literally loaded out with ordnance and things like that, I would do everything I could to avoid that, not just because it might not be a smart decision, but because I'm not configured to do so. So no question on my mind that there's a huge disparity in what the nose-to-tail capability of the airplanes are between 4th and 5th gen, and I'll use that term comfortably as a 5th gen fighter pilot. I say it all the time. You're not making configuration changes, and that makes a huge difference. If you have a air-to-ground or a air-to-air loadout configured aircraft, you do not want to be in a turning fight because your airplane will not perform the way it does with nothing on it. Not true for an F-22 and F-35.
You want to respond?
Sure. Assuming that the Lockheed pilot was honest about the 50% fuel and they didn't rip anything else out of the airplane, the only thing they didn't have was ordnance. Even granted, if they put in the ordnance that airplane was capable of flying with, that airplane was totally incapable of combat. And that's not me talking, that's the operational testers of the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. In their assessment of that airplane, that configuration that was flying in Paris, to go to war, it needs an escort to protect it against enemy fighters. It needs extra help to find targets, because it has great difficulty finding targets by itself, particularly air-to-ground threats. And in that configuration, it's completely incapable of close support. So if we're saying that the airplane that flew at Paris was capable of combat, this is not my opinion. This is a published opinion of the operational testers as published in the annual report of the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. Not his opinion either. It's the actual testers who've been testing the airplane and preparing to test it against real combat scenarios. So that airplane that flew in Paris could not meet any of the combat scenarios that they're talking about without help.
Great. Do you want to respond to that? Okay. So let's move on, in the interest of time, to the second question. Bigger picture, we were talking about dogfighting. The the F-35 is never supposed to get into a dogfight anyway. This is what the planners say. So how, Dave, does the F-35's information fusion, networking, capability across multi-domains, how does that change the game for warfare?
Well, I would say that I can't think of any airplane that we're flying today that would want to get into a dogfight. I would avoid that in any platform. And probably the best frame of reference is flying an F-22, which is the most capable dogfighting platform if you're just talking about performance of the aircraft. I wouldn't want to get into a dogfight in a Raptor. I'd avoid it at all costs. At almost all costs. It'd be a last resort for me. It'd be very difficult for me to retain all the strengths and qualities of my airplane in a Raptor if I was sitting there very predictably turning in relationship to another aircraft. So F-22 pilots don't fly around looking for dogfights. They fly around taking advantage of all the other strengths of the platform to avoid doing that. And if you do end up having to get into a relatively close range with someone where that person might end up finding you visually, your goal is to be at such an offensive advantage and such an overwhelming advantage, or in theory watching that person explode, that you're not really at great risk. But in the greatest dogfighting platform flying around today, nobody's looking to dogfight in that. There's no Raptor guys that would ever tell you their goal today in a straight up air-to-air fight would be to get into a dogfight. I would say that's even more so in a legacy platform, an F-16, F-15, and F-18. You would definitely not want to get into a turning fight. And the way you do that, and that's part of the reason why the F-35 and the F-22 have such massive advantage over legacy platforms, is the ability to make really intelligent decisions because you have the most amount of information presented to you. It's really not that complicated in the sense of you're getting information presented to you on a much larger scale. It's fused much more intelligently. You're not spending a lot of time varying your eyesight through the cockpit and saying, this is telling me this is telling me that, my wing was telling me this, let's talk about it, let's make some real-time considerations and evaluations and ultimately make a decision. Again, everything I'm speaking of is from the inside of a cockpit of a fighter. That's all I've done my career, is flown fighters and flown them in combat. And of course, I was a forward air controller, so I've seen it from the other side. It's all about making an intelligent decision as soon as you can. And that decision may be to turn with somebody or not turn with somebody, or fly into a position where I avoid that person. There are times you have any aircraft out there that you just want to bypass them. You just manipulate your geometry to they never see you, and you just get away from them because you might have limited ordnance or limited fuel or limited time, whatever the higher priority missions are. So I think it's really important for the listeners to understand, as we, Mr. Spray and I, talk for the rest of the time, we don't take off like running around the battle space looking for an airplane to turn with and engage with. We typically have a whole task load of other things that are higher priority, and those aircraft are typically an impediment to us accomplishing other missions. Sometimes the mission is just to do air-to-air, and if you're going to do that, do it so they can't see you, do it so they can't fly you, do it so a bunch of them die before they get to make intelligent decisions and change the game there. It's really difficult for me to overstate what a massive advantage you have in decision making in the F-35. You have airplanes right now, combat configured, combat capable airplanes at red flag that Marines are flying them, and if you brought a Marine in here and asked if he'd take that airplane to combat, he would not only say yes. If you asked him, would you take that or an F-16 or that or an F-18, they would probably laugh at you. They'd probably say, look, it's just not really a conversation that we're having anymore. I don't know a single pilot, and I know a lot of F-35 pilots that would even consider taking their legacy platform into combat in any environment, certainly not an environment we're thinking about of what the future of our combat is. So is the airplane supposed to dogfight or not? Most airplanes want to avoid dogfights in combat at all costs. The F-35 advantage over these other platforms is infinitely greater. And I can make smart decisions to, in theory, kill folks or get away from folks or avoid folks so long as I have to turn. But if you're asking someone in an F-35, are they worried about, could you survive a dogfight with another platform? Of course, yeah. We have an incredibly capable airplane and incredibly capable training. It's all the same reasons we, for decades, are better than everybody else in the world, is because we have great equipment and great training, and we're long continuum of practicing. So that's why dogfighting, BFM, basic fighter maneuvers, that's why we're trained to it all the time, because it's a skill you have to have. And to say that, well, your airplane somehow limits your ability to do that, I don't know I don't know a single pilot that would agree with that. It's just not accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Let me take it in two parts. You said that the F-35 was never supposed to dogfight, and nobody's claimed it would. That's false. The original marketing hype both out of the services and out of Lockheed, was always, it's a great dogfighter, it's a great close support platform, it's a great bomber, it's all that. Of course, in truth is, it can't do any of those missions very well, because like all multi-mission airplanes, it's highly flawed, and even worse, the execution, the technical execution of this airplane is particularly bad, unusually bad by historical standards. On the other hand, I totally agree with Colonel Burke that no airplane looks for a dogfight. I mean, this is going back to the World War I, World War II. Of course, you just want to bounce some guy by surprise and not have a fight. Just have, run up another score. You get 5 of them, you're an ace. and a lot of the German aces were very explicit about that. If they saw a guy even look halfway competent in a counter maneuver, forget it. I'll go find somebody who's easier. That's the way you live to fight a long war. So no problem with that. On the other hand, all wars against competent enemies wind up in big dogfights. No matter how much you want to avoid them. I mean, let me back up. That's not quite correct. All serious wars, I'm not talking about fighting in the Near East, I'm talking about serious wars that we've experienced and that other people have experienced. We have decent, fairly competent air forces on both sides. You wind up in tangles. The good pilots all avoid the dogfight and come home with kills. Sometimes you can't avoid it. You got to have an airplane that is not a target, simply a target when you can't avoid a dogfight. The F-35 is a horrible target if it has to get into a dogfight, just for fundamental reasons aside from the screw-ups and the engineering. It's got enormously high wind loading, so it really can't turn very well. I mean, it's almost as unmaneuverable as the famous F-104. It has about that wing load. So the turn performance, energy maneuverability performance is pretty poor, except for, 1G flight, straight and level. Acceleration's moderately decent, not world beating, but so-so. The real question, if you're going to evaluate what happens in air-to-air, air-to-air in general, not dogfighting, of course, is to visualize lots of airplanes. 2 on 8, 4 on 2, 8 on 8, that kind of thing. That's what real combat's about. I totally agree. One guy fighting one guy is like the least common thing. And that's what good testing is about, is to create those scenarios in which you can test what happens when you've got multiple airplanes. And what happens when you get multiple airplanes looks very bad for the F-35. Even with just 2 F-35s, they're having all kinds of trouble coordinating on targets. Again, this is not my opinion. This is the testers reporting what they have found. Is they try to fuse targets from 2 airplanes, just a 2-ship flight. They wind up with a whole bunch of false targets. So instead of easing the pilot's workload, you're piling it on with false target. Now he's got to sort out what's the real target, this is what's going on right now in testing. Now, if you're not in that kind of stressful scenario, if you're out training and everything's like a beautiful setup, which I suspect is what Colonel Burke has mostly seen, sure, you don't have to worry about that stuff. But, if you're in a stressing situation, which is what good testing is about, and which is very much what combat is about, everything looks different. And this airplane ain't working. All that networking stuff and everything, that's, if it worked, would be so wonderful and would make life easier for the pilot and make him smarter and more situationally aware. Right now, it's an impediment, and it could very well be an impediment for a long time to come. In fact, it might be a permanent impediment given the cyber situation, which is horrible for this airplane. And in a way, all that reliance on networking is you're actually giving, inferior, less well-funded, less well equipped enemies a tremendous opportunity, because this airplane is so vulnerable to all kinds of cyber meddling. And if there's one thing that the people we might face, like Chinese, Russians, whatever, Yugoslavs, they're all pretty clever with computers, as we found out, and they're cleverly getting into our computers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, if you don't think they aren't getting into F-35, we have given them a tremendous opportunity to wreck our air power for almost no money, because we have made ourselves so dependent on this, on this wonderful promise of networking to come, and the future is beautiful, and wait till we develop the apps for this airplane and all that, right? The more we rely on that, the more we're giving them a golden opportunity.
So Dave, maybe you want to respond to that. Maybe you can talk about your training and what you saw as an operational pilot.
Certainly. I mean, obviously, I would disagree with virtually all of that, to include the Yugoslavia reference. The beauty of being here, and why I enjoy this so much, is that your listeners and really everybody involved in the conversation now get to really hear two very different perspectives that are sort of steeped in personal experience and that background. So, my frame of reference, like I said before, is from the inside of a cockpit. It's difficult for me to sort of hear the characterizations and then put my own lens on that and say, and I wonder sort of where you come up with those comments. So the idea that there are things wrong with the airplane, which is 100% true, and the airplane doesn't work, which is 100% not true. It's important. I think we need to be very careful about sort of speaking with these kind of superlatives and speaking in absolutes. There are a lot of people flying F-35s right now. A lot. Literally as we speak, Thursday the 20th at 1:30 in the afternoon, there's a red flag going on at Nellis with Marine Bs out there. The idea that we're flying in these sort of sanitary environments that isn't being stressed, and the idea that you look at a test report and say we had problems with fusion and then draw the conclusion the airplane doesn't work. All I would offer is that not one single solitary F-35 pilot in the world would agree with that comment, to include me. And not only would I disagree, I would disagree as strongly as I could on a radio show and using the language that I can to say that's simply not the case. Now, Nellis is awesome because you can create a really dynamic environment. I think you need to put other things into context too when you're talking about sensor fusion. If you want to just take two airplanes and like fuse a single target with the F-35, that's not a big deal. To fuse multispectral, broadband multispectral information, RF, electro-optical, infrared, laser energy, and fuse it between several cockpits, off-station users, ground users, sea-based platforms. This is really complicated stuff. And so there are things wrong with the airplane. I don't know a single person, other pilot, that deny that either. That's the whole point of them being out there. The idea that you would read some sort of report on an airplane's performance and then draw the conclusion the airplane is broken forever is just kind of a leap that the people that are most familiar with it are that's part of the reason why I'm here. That's what we're trying to fight against the most. And I think it speaks to what his comments speak to something that I need to take some personal responsibility for. Is we, I think, inside the community haven't done a really good job of explaining how amazing the airplane is. And some of that is probably just inability on my part to draw a comparison between things we're doing in the past and what we're doing now. What we're doing now is really about what we think is going to happen in the future. And Mr. Spray and I, and you could bring 100 people in this room and say, what's warfare going to look like in 30 years? You're going to get 30 different answers. This is a really complicated question, and this can be very difficult. What you need is an airplane that is designed and capable of being the most relevant for the most unpredictable scenarios in the world. If I hear somebody talk about dogfighting, that's a red flag for me to say that's a person who's not thinking about the future. If I hear somebody say wing loading, that's a red flag for me saying you are thinking about the wrong things. 23 years as a Marine, multiple combat deployments. Every Marine, every Air Force pilot, every Navy pilot I know that is flying the F-35 that came from a legacy aircraft, Hornets, some folks have flown F-15s, F-16s, different platforms, they're all flying the F-35. There is no debate. There is no, they don't, rub their chin or ask their, scratch their head and want. There is no debate, even a tiny bit, about what is the most capable airplane they've ever flown and what airplane would they take into combat tomorrow. Currently configured. One of my closest friends is the Marine CO that took the airplanes out to Japan. We have a forward deployed, combat-capable operational F-35 squadron in the Asia Pacific right now. The comment that the Marine Corps doesn't think this airplane is combat capable, that's just not true. And not only is it not combat capable, compared to what this airplane is going to do in the future, yeah, there's a long way to go. We have a lot to learn about this airplane, a lot to figure out. Compared to anything we've done in the past, it's not even close. And so as a pilot, as someone who commanded a squadron, who ran operational tests in the F-22, who flew these other airplanes, and I hear the criticism, I think we need to do a better job of being more articulate and more effective in explaining to the American people who pay their tax dollars for this airplane, to explain to them, hey, what it is that we're trying to accomplish, what the airplane is actually capable of doing. I wish I could stream rate a bunch of pilots in here. The bottom line is no pilot would agree with that. Nobody close to the airplane agrees with that. The largest and loudest criticism are from the people the farthest away. I don't know a single person who's read into the program, who's flown it, who's fixed it, who's designed it, who's maintained it, that thinks like that. And those are people that don't know about the airplane. But for me, it's not fair to go, well, I know better than you, and make people hit the I believe button. I need to explain it better and be more articulate. And that's my job. That's part of the reason why I kind of am thrilled to be here, because I get to give an alternate point of view from other people's perspective on an airplane that I know a whole lot about from personal experience. Mm-hmm. And whether that's compelling is ultimately up to the listener.
Mm-hmm. So Pierre, you did bring up a good point though about testing. So there have been, they do keep discovering issues during operational tests, and they have started producing and flying airplanes before the program has been finished with SDD. So can you talk about the difficulties presented by this kind of concurrency that the Air Force is doing?
I mean, first of all, let's make a very clear distinction. There's development testing, mm-hmm. or engineering testing, and there's operational testing. Engineering testing is to demonstrate that the airplane meets its contract specifications and meets, the various handling specifications and every safety, all that. But purely an engineering thing, just to confirm that people work, pieces of the airplane work according to what was designed. Operational testing is where you turn over the airplane to people who don't give a damn what the contract said. They're people who have to go fly the airplane in combat. And they're there to wring it out and to put it in all the nasty situations that they can think of that combat involves, and say, yeah, we can go to combat with this, or no, we can't, or you got to fix this and then we can go to combat. Mm-hmm. That hasn't even started. There are operational test pilots working with the airplane to get familiar with it. Right now we're in the middle of the development testing, right? With operational test pilots looking over the shoulders of the developers and, assessing the same data the developers are turning out, and, trying to get ready for these very stressing scenarios that they've already designed. Basically, the whole test plan was settled and agreed between all the services and the Joint Project Office and the Operational Test Office about 7 years ago. So when we're talking about test results right now, there basically aren't any test results in realistic, stressful scenarios. Okay? And that's the problem. What we're seeing is already miserable. Really bad stuff, despite Colonel Burke's very, very persuasive salesmanship. This is not the facts on the ground, and I have mixed feelings about pilots being so enthusiastic about their airplanes. I don't think it's a great attitude. It's very common now, because it's also, the services are so wound up with procurement, and people who are critical of their equipment tend to have shorter careers. I'll just quote John Boyd, his view of what a useful, productive fighter pilot attitude is: they give us crap and we win anyhow. I think that's a real solid. You want to be skeptical about everything you work with. You don't want to be a true believer and go into combat thinking, wow, this is the greatest thing, I'm so safe, I couldn't believe it, and wind up hanging from a parachute or dead. Mm-hmm. But back to the testing question. The testing that has taken place so far is very benign. It's engineering testing. There hasn't been any rough testing yet, and the airplane has performed very badly on a whole score of issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could just interrupt you there, I'm not sure that is actually true, because I have been out to Edwards Air Force Base and talked to the developmental test pilots, and there are operational test pilots out there. So when they get a software iteration, the DT pilots go at it, and then they hand it off to the OT pilots.
Yeah, but they're not flying against stressful scenarios yet,
mm-hmm.
For a very simple reason, because the Joint Project Office is sabotaging the operational tests. The operational tests are so late and so crippled by lack of equipment, you can't believe it. And this is very deliberate. There's operational testing, not just for the F-35, for anything, for a rifle, a tank, a tanker airplane, whatever, a carrier, is very dangerous, right? Because you might, if you fail, the contract might be canceled, right? So it's the natural reaction of the developer himself. I don't mean just the contractor, but the service branch that's developing the airplane, and the development testers, to be very reluctant to say anything negative because it affects the possibility of funding, right? That's a terrible thing. That kills transparency. That kills real progress of turning weapons into useful things. And it's crippled us many times, on any number of Turkey systems that we've kept going vastly longer than they should have, or that we could have fixed and didn't, because people were defending them to the hilt so that the funding would keep on flowing. This is the dead hand of procurement is really hard on combat capability.
And that is a danger of concurrency, I think.
So the fact that the development testers didn't tell you that there was a problem doesn't mean a thing. They'd probably get fired if they did.
Well, they have actually told me that there are problems. I've spoken with them, and
But the real problems are published. That's what I'm trying to say. We don't have to be arguing about what pilots say. They've been published. There's an amazing window of honesty in the annual reports of the development of the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. That's a window that we've never had before that position was established, right? And you can go to it, and that's a place you ought to argue from. We look at that, we say, well, the fusion isn't working. Yeah, maybe it can be cured, but let's start from a very clear perception that it's not working. It's giving you a lot of false targets, right? Instead of, oh, well, don't worry about that, the future is beautiful, right? Well, let's start from here and now and the facts, and then talk about which future is beautiful and, is it achievable or not?
So do you think it's achievable?
So just going out there to Edwards and, getting the vibe, that's not telling you anything, because, you, me, we're all outsiders. What we're going to get is the sales vibe, not the real vibe. But the real vibe is published, in a way that nobody else can do, because the people who are writing it are the actual operational testers who provide their assessment, their data, and so on. And because of this window of having this office that is allowed to look at all that data and publish what is unclassified, this is something we've never had before. And people keep on avoiding it. People keep on going back to, all the people who are in love with the airplane and saying, oh, they're all in love with the airplane, so it must be all right. Right? Unfortunately, that's the way the taxpayer, gets bilked.
Well, it's a lead into, I think, a really important point, because I try to put myself in the ears of the listener. I want to be very clear about something, and I'll explain it hopefully effectively. Being a fighter pilot is a profession. This isn't a movie. We don't wake up in the morning, comb our hair, and go live Hollywood. Fighter pilots, like any other profession in the U.S. military, dedicate themselves every single day of their life to mastering their skill set, mastering their arts, mastering their mission sets. The idea that any professional uniformed military officer, let alone fighter pilot, would somehow find themselves unprepared for the horrors of combat because they were elusively in love with their equipment and failed to realize that they're actually underperformed in the real world is preposterous. I've flown airplanes with tremendous strengths and tremendous weaknesses, and I've done it operations through my entire life. As a Top Gun instructor, we would spend 8 hours debriefing a flight, and all you do is talk about the things you did wrong. All you do is talk about the areas of your aircraft that you need to perform better. All you do is talk about your strengths and your weaknesses, how to mitigate one and play to the other. It is a profession. It is no joke. And for someone who has been in combat both in the air and on the ground numerous times, and someone who's buried a Marine who died in ground combat, nobody in the military doesn't take their profession absolutely seriously. So if you're going to ask someone in the uniformed services, a fighter pilot doing operational tests, what their opinion is, the idea that even one shred of the thing they would say is a party line answer, I would presume to be offensive to everybody in uniform. I spent 23 years as a U.S. Marine, and never once did I get the implication that I shouldn't be completely honest with my evaluation and my assessment. My job as a F-22 Raptor pilot, as fun as that was, I was an operational test pilot. My job was to tell the engineers, to tell the designers, to tell the builders everything wrong with the airplane. This is the F-22, mind you. So we should be very clear as we draw a stark contrast between our viewpoints about this airplane and really everything. Professional military soldiers of all the services, they care about their jobs because they're the ones that take the airplanes and the tanks and the guns and the rifles and the bombs into combat. And the idea of being unprepared because we're infatuated with our equipment is preposterous. The F-35, like every platform ever built in the history of warfare, has things good about it and things bad about it. I'll tell you right now, the operational test world, the operational world, all we are doing is focusing on making the airplanes better. That laundry list of things that may be improved, that's what we spend our time on. The problem is that when you have this overwhelming amount of evidence that every single pilot in the F-35 community has experienced by taking their airplane into highly complex environments at Red Flag, places like Nellis, and they come back with overwhelming dominance, it's very difficult to not be really supportive of your platform because you do so well. And so if you hear that from pilots saying that F-35 is awesome, it's not a sales pitch or a cheerleading pitch. It's reality. And it's reality steeped in a long history of flying several different airplanes in several different environments. And so I sit here with the luxury of being a retired Marine who's not getting paid or nobody even knows I'm here. I don't even tell my friends that I'm here. This is strictly on my own time. I'm a husband and a father of 3 kids. And if you think for 1 second I would strap on an airplane and take it into combat that somehow I thought was better than it really was, would marginalize me as a professional Marine and as a fighter pilot and everything I've ever done. Everybody comes to work every day in the military, making their equipment as good as it can be, studying the enemy, studying their strengths and their weaknesses, and creating a plan to be successful on behalf of the American taxpayer that's actually paying our salary and buying us equipment. We take that responsibility very seriously. And I know a lot of Marines. I was 23 years a Marine. I don't know one Marine who didn't feel like they could speak articulately and accurately about good and bad things. I know that's how it was in my squadrons I've ever been in. That's how it was. And I've dealt with several senior officers. The first operational 35 commanding officer. I know what it's like to deal with 3 and 4 stars on a regular basis. And if you think for 1 second any of them told me you better cover up the bad news and only talk about the good stuff, that is ridiculous. This airplane is as good as everybody says it is because it's as good as everybody says it is. And the only frame of reference they have is a lifetime of preparing and conducting combat operations and then flying 4 different operational airplanes and looking at those things. So we take that very seriously. And I would echo something Mr. Spray said, I think very articulate. We owe that to the taxpayers. They're paying they did, I'm retired, they paid my salary. And they paid for the expensive equipment that we have. And that operational test, and I'll give a shout out to VMX-1 and the 422 Test and Evaluation Squadron, operational test, robust operational test and evaluation is going on with the F-35 right now. Those guys go to work every day and say, let's find something else wrong that we can fix. We are the most critical, demanding group of people I could possibly imagine, a bunch of type A people that want to find things wrong with the airplane and fix it. So when they do go to combat, which they will, they do extremely well against a very capable enemy who's doing everything they can right now to match or exceed the things that we are building. You want to know how good the F-22 and the F-35 are? Look at what the adversaries are building. You think flattery, copying something is the sincerest form of flattery? Yeah, it is. There's the reason why they're trying to build airplanes that look like the Raptor and the F-35. And it's not because they don't work, or they're not effective, or they're targets, or they're a waste of time and money. And one of my jobs as a Marine, and I should have done a better job, is being more effective at explaining to those taxpayers whose patriotic duty was to allow me to come to work every day and do that, explaining them that their money is very well spent. And so I take that, obviously, I take that very personally, that's a real objective. And I think what he said is 100% right. That's what our job should be, because we owe that to the taxpayer. I have yet to meet one person in my entire career that didn't see it the same way, ever.
So before we move on, I just do want to interject. When I went to Edwards and I met the DT pilots and I watched them take off and do a flight, and they had to shut down the airplane several times before it actually took off. They didn't hide the fact from me that they were having problems with the 3i software. It shut down several times. It was more than an hour before they actually took off. So I will just say that I felt they were being quite transparent with me about that.
I've lived that several times. You go to Cold Iron, you got to get things started. Absolutely, there's several. That's what we're there for. That's what operational testers. That's what I did in the Raptor for 4 years. That's what operational test is. I don't want to hear your glossy brochure good news story. I'm going to look at everything that I can find with this airplane and hold your feet to the fire to make it better. And that's what we do. And that's the beauty of having an operational capable airplane in the hands of a pilot, an operational pilot, as soon as humanly possible. Because those are the people that can be the most critical, just like he described. He's a great description from Mr. Spray about what operational pilots are doing. They're the ones that put their combat lens on and go, this is what I'm taking to combat. I'm going to test it and evaluate it just like that. So that's exactly what we're doing, and that's why we're so critical about it. The reason you hear such good news is because the airplane's incredible. That's why you're hearing good news. Nobody gave me a little piece of paper that says, say this into the radio or say this to the TV. We say what we think. We're human beings like everybody else, steeped in a lifetime of serving the country. That's what we do.
Let me just comment. I take very seriously Colonel Burke's description of what a good professional fighter pilot is like. And he's absolutely on the money. The great ones I've known are exactly like that. I have no doubt that Colonel Burke himself is one of those professionals. But to say that every military person, every fighter pilot is that kind of professional is to live in an alternate universe. Like anything else, like any other profession. There are people who do it well, there are people who do it moderately well, there are people who ham fists, and there are people, who don't do it at all, whatever. And the idea that every officer simply tells you flat out, with no view to his career, that this is the way it is, that's some other universe. I've been around fighter pilots for 50 years, listening to them very carefully, because that's very much part of the way I approach airplane design, is hearing what people are saying, particularly from the experience point of view. I never discount experience. And I got to tell you, the idea that every fighter pilot is this sterling, career ignoring, combat-oriented professional, that universe doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in any profession, and most certainly doesn't exist in the military profession. What I will say is, at the lowest ranks, it's almost completely true. You're talking to lieutenants and captains and so on. You find some astonishingly dedicated people. That's why I keep on going back to Nellis twice a year to give talks, to talk to those people, because it's inspiring to be around them. The higher the rank, the more lies you get. It's that simple. And to think that senior officers don't lie is ludicrous.
So let's move on. I really do want to talk about the cost of the aircraft. There's no question that has been a big problem, and this program went through a lot of challenges over the years. In general, the last couple of years, costs have come down, but this year they ticked up slightly, from about $380 billion to $406 billion. So how much of a problem right now is cost, do you think, Pierre?
Let me start by saying, how good an airplane is in combat is one thing, and how much it costs is another. They're very closely interrelated. To think that, maybe it's expensive, but it's the greatest airplane in the world, so we need it. This is like turning off your brain, right? Of course, cost is part of the force you can bring to bear. And that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about individual airplanes, one-on-one dogfights. We're talking about air power. To create air power, you have to be able to put a bunch of airplanes in the sky over the enemy, right? You can't do it with a tiny handful, even if they're unbelievably good, right? You send 6 airplanes to China, they could care less what they are, right? I mean, it's ludicrous, right? And that's kind of what we're doing, F-22 deployments now are 6 airplane deployments. Think about that. And that's because of cost. Force and effectiveness create air power. But force is a function of cost and how reliable the airplane is, how often it flies per day. That's what tells you how many airplanes are going to be in the sky threatening the enemy, which is what we want. Airplanes on the ground are not weapons, they're targets, right? And particularly for a clever enemy, they're very lucrative targets, right? We're building a whole bunch of airplanes that spend an unbelievable amount of time on the ground and fly very little, you know? And that's because they cost too much. They have gotten so much complexity built into them that they have become extremely difficult to maintain. You know, I mean, shockingly difficult to maintain in terms of just flying them. I'm not talking about the cost of maintaining them. I'm just talking about getting them off the ground, converting them from targets to weapons. You know, is becoming very rare. You know, I'll give you just one example that is really shocking. It's from one of your numbers, Laura. The F-22 in combat in that little puny 6-airplane detachment that they call a squadron, which is a joke, right? That's over there, you know, in CENTCOM, you know, flying wherever they're flying, Syria, Iraq, whatnot. Those airplanes, since the beginning of their deployment, which was the beginning of Operational Inherent Resolve, have been flying 1/5 of a sortie a day. In other words, they're flying less often than once every 5 days. And these are like hand-picked airplanes. They don't go to combat unless they're in perfect shape, right? And they only stay for 6 months. It's not like they have to fight a long war. They come home, get fixed again, and new hand-picked airplanes come out. And all they can crank out of those airplanes is 1/5 of a sortie a day. If you think that's applying air power, that's, you know, that's a joke. And that's because of cost, right? You're saying the airplane has risen in cost slightly, but has come down slightly. We have no idea. They have buried so many costs of this airplane. What you really mean to say is the cost they announced has come down, and this year it came up. But there are so many other contracts where they're hiding F-35 specific costs that no one knows. You know, all you know is it's a lot. And one of the real specific costs that they aren't talking about is the cost to fix all those airplanes that we have flying now that have very severe combat limitations, because we can't just keep on flying them as they are. They will not work properly in combat. Nobody has told us what it's going to cost. Every airplane that we turn out right now is like a do-it-yourself kit, right? It's full of deficiencies that have got to be fixed eventually. Structural, aerodynamic, lots of computer deficiency, sensor deficiencies out the gazoo, helmet problems. All that has to be fixed. Nobody has told you what the bill is. So when you say 400 billion, there's a very good chance the real bill is 600 billion or 800 billion because of 400 billion of hidden cost. So you want to be a little modest about what we know about cost. And we certainly don't know that it's been going down. All we know is they have a strong incentive to tell us it's going down. So, in fact, they may be incurring future fixes at a faster rate than they can actually implement small production efficiencies. We don't know because nobody's being truthful. That's the problem.
Right. So just
But just to give you an idea of what we're talking about for cost and air power, you know, for every, say, F-16 that you bought, if you compared, you know, at the same budget, $400 billion, if we were buying F-16s instead of buying F-35s, you would be able to buy 5 times more airplanes. Basically, the F-35 is 5 times as expensive as a basic, you know, F-35 as we designed it. I mean, before it got all loaded up with other stuff to make it look like an F-35. So it's 5 times as expensive, and it flies at best half as often. To be honest, my feeling is it will fly less often than an F-22. It's a good deal more complicated than F-22, and it's showing that right now. If that's the case, then it may only fly once every 5 days, in which case it'll fly, you know, 1/5 as often as an F-16. So you multiply those two numbers, you get 5 times as many airplanes, and being generous, twice as many in the sky, because you fly twice as often. For a given amount of money, you've got 10 times the airplanes in the air, you know, and that's the thing you have to balance against, you know, is this airplane going to be as good as 10 Chinese fighters that cost what an F-16 fighter costs? So, you know, It's very important to keep in mind effectiveness and cost at the same time, because they're all part of air power.
So just to be clear, the $400 billion is total acquisition cost. That's not the operational cost. The total cost to
That's
fly
pro-
the fleet
That's
is
procurement.
over.
That's only
Right.
procurement
Yes,
cost.
it's over $1 trillion
And
projected for the entire life of the fleet, which is another
except for the
50
hidden
years.
costs, which may be as large as what's announced. They'll certainly be at least a third to a half greater than what's announced. I mean, no question about it, just for fixing the airplanes we got.
So Dave, would you agree with Pierre on
That
the
was
cost?
a lot of math for a Marine to try to keep up with. And I can't
thought
speak
it was
intelligently.
arithmetic.
I can't speak intelligently to conspiracies of hidden. I don't know about any of that stuff. That there's secret costs that nobody's telling anybody about. That's a world I don't live in. If that world exists, it'd be disappointing to think that the Chinese are explicit with how much the airplanes are going to cost, and we aren't. I don't subscribe to that, but ultimately, I can't show you my dossier to prove it. I would agree strongly with the idea that we want as many airplanes as we can for the least amount of money. Who wouldn't argue that? I mean, who wouldn't agree with that concept? And I think part of my motivation for being here is obviously sharing the room with someone who sees it the exact same way. You need airplanes. You need air power, just like you described. But we have to put cost into context. You got to be very careful when you talk about airplanes that cost X amount of money and then compare it to an airplane that was built in the 70s and how much money that cost. The worst thing we can do is spend money on an airplane, however much money that is, if it's a tenth of the cost or twice the cost of an F-35. If that airplane is irrelevant in combat or it cannot fly in environments that the threat can create to prevent everyone from flying, I don't care how cheap the airplane is. If you can't fly it in combat, it's useless. So we are, I think, at a very difficult time where you have these highly complex airplanes. You have these airplanes that have all these different requirements, all these different capabilities, which are really difficult to do. We're literally inventing technology that didn't exist before in these airplanes. And it's all driven towards the idea of actually being relevant in a highly complex, three-dimensional battle space that we have a really hard time even predicting for the next 15 years. So I don't want to buy a car that's cheaper and then have that car not be drivable in 3 years and say, hey, I saved some money by buying this cheaper car. The problem is I'm trying to get into the Indy 500 and I can't drive my Honda Odyssey there, even though it's a lot less than an Indy car. The world of warfare is complex, and it's getting more and more complex. The fact that you're going to reference Chinese fifth-generation airplanes, guess what? That's happening. They're building and buying them right now, and that's going to make air warfare complicated. I would love to have one job, one weapon, and one mission. I would love that. My job would be really easy. I've never lived in that world. In the Hornet, we had in the F-16, the F-22, and now the F-35, countless missions, countless capabilities and requirements, and have to be good at all those things. I can't imagine being in an airplane and being tasked to do something by the President of the United States or the Commandant of the Marine Corps and saying, oh, I can't do that. I'm not able to do that. And so the idea of cost, it's really important that this airplane be as cheap as it possibly can be, and then we build as many of them. That's why I said I'd echo that strongly, what he said. But you better build an airplane that is relevant to the life of that airplane. And we are very rapidly approaching an environment where many of the airplanes that we have that are flying, that have fleet life capability on the airframes, they can't fly because the environment is too dangerous for them. And the only airplanes right now that can fly anywhere are the F-22 and the F-35. And even that's getting harder every single day. That's what we do in the world of fifth-gen flying, is how do we fly in the most dangerous, demanding, difficult, complex environments and then increase the survivability and lethality of the other airplanes around us. Whatever we do, whatever we spend our money on, it's really important we don't spend money on something that doesn't do us any good 10 years from now. It's a really complicated problem. I wish it wasn't. I wish it was simple. I wish we had a crystal ball and said, this is what the world's going to look like in 2035. Let's just build an airplane that works really well there. We can't. And I think it's really easy to demonize and be critical of things that we don't understand or things that we disagree with or things that are projections. You know what? You know what's really hard? Innovation's really hard. It's really hard, and it's really easy to criticize, and it's really easy to be skeptical, because innovators can't say, I promise you the world will look like this in 20 years. Because that's just their perspective on the world. And so people that sit around and innovate and come up with really difficult ideas and challenging ideas, hey, if you're up in the stadium watching that thing as a spectator, it's easy to criticize that. That's the easiest thing in the world to do. And I understand that world. I see people do that all the time. I would go back to the comment I made earlier. is the people that know most about the airplane, that are captains and majors like you described, the people that are most familiar with this are the ones that are most impressed by it and are the biggest advocates. They're the ones saying the loudest voice, this thing does things that we didn't even know it can do. That we are doing things in the F-35 or thinking about doing things in the future that even the designers didn't think about. I told you about the iPhone in the last time I was here. The iPhone isn't that it's a newer phone. It's that the thing it was designed for, nobody does those things anymore. When you ask what the iPhone does, nobody says it's an MP3 player. I know it's an MP3 player, but nobody describes it like that. It's the thing that gets you to the airport and buys you food and applies for a mortgage. It's all these laundry lists of things that nobody could predict 15 years ago because innovation's hard. So yes, cost, critical. The number of airplanes, critical. We want the largest force with the greatest amount of capability. But whatever you do, make sure you buy and build and spend money on something that actually has a useful life out of it. Because if you find yourself with this really nice, shiny airplane that's got thousands of hours left on the airframe, but you can't fly it in contested battle space, I don't care how much money you saved, it doesn't do you any good. So if you want to just say it's too expensive, that's easy to say. It's too expensive. Compared to what? Losing a war in 15 years? Or compared to an F-16 in 1977? Make sure you get that frame of reference right, because it's really important.
Mm-hmm. So we only have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to wrap this up just by asking Pierre, you talked about the testing problems, the cost problems. Do you think that this aircraft will eventually deliver the operational capability that it's promised? Do you agree with the concept of a multi-role aircraft instead of a single-role aircraft and fusion and networking? Do you think, even if you think the kinks aren't worked out yet, what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I'm not a crystal ball gazer, right, as some of our technology enthusiasts are about how all these problems will be solved in the future. Mm-hmm. I'm here to deal with real war as best we can understand it, and we have to start by understanding in the past and understanding capabilities in the present. And you have to understand that when somebody says the world is getting so dangerous that only F-22s can survive, that's based on some intelligence inputs that are largely hogwash. And we've been fed hogwash about foreign capabilities for a long time because it's part of, the general political scene, keep the budget high and all that. I mean, that goes back right to the beginning of the Cold War. It's just gotten worse over time. Assessing the threat realistically is of the utmost importance. And I totally agree with Colonel Burke. You don't want to go into war with something that's not going to work against real threats. But whether it's going to work against some concocted threat that some intelligence analyst made up so that the defense budget can go from $600 billion to $800 billion, that gets you in a lot of trouble because you start developing stuff that doesn't work at all. Right? Sadly, so I'm not even going to start by saying the F-35 is going to eventually be effective or not. What I will say is if we let the current situation go, we will never know until combat whether that airplane is worth a single crap. And right now what's happening is we're allowing the Joint Program Office and the airplane's advocates to sabotage operational testing of the airplane, which is the only thing that will tell us whether that airplane will survive against real threats. And let me be real specific. The operational testers 7 years ago put out a requirement for simulators of the threat that Colonel Burke was talking about, which is certainly different than past threats, and in some ways more capable, in some ways perhaps less. That's exactly what we need to operate against. And to really find out whether we want that airplane, we want to fly the airplane, multiple airplanes, 6, 8, whatever, the largest flight we can, and legacy airplane against the same threat. The current management of the F-35 has made it impossible to do that because they've actually deliberately slow-rolled the contracts, slow-rolled the procurement. They haven't even got the instrumentation, the basic instrumentation that we needed to even start operational testing. Some of that's not even under contract yet. And the threat simulators are in much worse shape. I mean, they're in such bad shape, we had to go abroad even to try to get realistic signals like enemy Soviet and Chinese radars put out, and enemy and Soviet, Chinese and Soviet SAM missiles put out. That stuff is like on top dead center. I mean, it is in such bad shape because of this deliberate sabotage of operational testing. And so the question is, pilots will have no idea until they get into combat, and maybe it'll work, and maybe they'll all wind up hanging from parachutes because we have not done what we need to do for them. This is what we owe them, is to do decent operational testing that's against real threats that we've actually built, simulated, and put out in the field and flown F-35s against, and flown F-18s against, and flown F-16s. Then we'll have a clear view. You know, the one thing I will predict is when you do that for the F-35 and the A-10, that answer is obvious. The F-35 will never do close support. It's hopeless.
So, Dave, same question to you. Do you think eventually this will deliver the operational capability that has been promised?
Yeah, certainly. And I've enjoyed this because I kept hearing him say things I agree with strongly. This idea of this really relevant testing against legitimate threats, or you know, like you talked about the simulated threats, or putting the airplane in the most demanding environment as possible now in training, so you're as prepared as you can be for combat. I would echo that strongly. I absolutely believe that. That's part of the reason why I was doing OT in Nellis right now with the F-22s, F-35s together, flying integrated missions with all the legacy airplanes. Like I said, this red flag, not yet another red flag, but F-35 is there, flying alongside F-16s, F-18s, Harriers, Strike Eagles, A-10s, all those things. And I have supreme confidence in the people that are out there doing these missions right now, whose sole objective is to reach exactly what Mr. Spray just said, is be as prepared as you can for when it actually happens in the real world. That goes back to that comment I made about professional, being a professional military officer, being a professional fighter pilot, what your job is. So I echo that. The airplane is going to be doing things that nobody even is thinking about right now in 15 years. I would look at any airplane in original design and then look at what it's doing now. Look at the first F-18 that came off the factory floor. Look at the first F-16. And compare that to what we designed it to do, or what we initially directed, specifications-wise it was going to do, and what it's doing now. The F-35 that our kids are flying is going to be doing things way beyond anything we're talking about right now. Way more. So meeting the specification and meeting that operational goal, you're going to vastly exceed that in ways you can't even predict, like we've always done, because you're going to put it in the hands of professionals. You're going to create this very difficult environment for them, and say your job, your task is to create a training cycle, a training continuum, and an ecosystem that allows you to succeed in combat. The most challenging environment in the world, the harshest teacher, and the most demanding setting you can possibly put somebody else in. For the people listening, in terms of what the thing I could do is try to get people to take away with a different perspective of who actually is really tasked with that. Don't think of Lockheed Martin as some big giant company trying to, get money for airplanes. Go to the factory floor and look at the people building the airplane on the assembly line, this giant, massive building. I saw it with the Raptor in Marietta. I see it with the F-35 in Fort Worth. The American men and women that come in every morning and building an airplane that's so intricate, and how much passion and love they have, and how amazingly involved they are in building something they know is going to go into the hands of a real warfighter one day and really fight a war, yet again, on behalf of the country. And how serious, that's what Lockheed Martin is. It's thousands upon thousands of people coming to work every day and building things for American men and women who are going to fly it in combat. And the people who go to work every day to fly it, to fix it, to maintain it, how passionate they are about doing that, because they're the ones who are going to do exactly what he said. They're going to find themselves in harm's way. And anybody who's ever been in harm's way knows how serious that is and how unforgiving that environment is. Are we going to meet, we're going to exceed it infinitely, because we have no other choice, because the world in 2020 and 2030 and 2040 is going to be vastly different than it is now. And how do I know that's going to happen? That's what people like us do every day. You get up in the morning, you go to work, and you do your job. Whether it's putting that airplane together from nose to tail on that giant factory floor, and you pour your heart, soul, and blood, sweat, and tears into that, and your passion and your belief, or you do it as a pilot, or you do it as a maintainer, or as an engineer, or anybody else. That's what we do. This is not about the sales pitch of the brochure. This is about people going to work every day and doing their job. And to be successful in combat, it's really hard. So I don't have any doubts that we can, but what Mr. Spray said, it's really difficult, and it requires an amazing amount of commitment and work. And if we take it for granted, like he alluded to, if we just sort of presume, hey, my stuff's better, I'm going to win, that's a recipe for disaster. And so to find another place of common ground, it's going to require people to go in every day and like, hey, we can take nothing for granted. We have to go do this and be as demanding and critical as we possibly can be. I'm extremely confident that's what we do every day. I live that. But the common ground for Mr. Spray and I is, the day we stop doing that, the day we stop really challenging ourselves to be successful in this demanding environment, that's a bad day for us. So no way we can let that happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both. That's about all we have time for. Again, I'm Lara Seligman. Thank you for listening, and join us next week on the Check 6 podcast.